Just to follow on, but with a slightly different tack, because how many people in the room have actually had an experience that you cannot explain by reductionist, Newtonian, empirical determination? Yeah? Everybody? Okay, let me ask the question the other way. How many people have never ever had an experience that you can't explain? Can I get one? And you're definitely old enough to have had some. Okay. If I'd asked that question in a room full of people under 40, I would have expected the majority of hands to go up. But the phrase "life begins at 40" actually has a much deeper inference than that's when the fun begins. Because you paid off all your debts or whatever, which ain't the case now anyway, is it? Life begins at 40. Because something happens around about the age of 40 that in the Western culture, in the Western materialist culture, is dismissed as the midlife crisis. But in indigenous cultures, it's revered as the midlife opportunity. And in fact, in many indigenous cultures, you cannot be considered to be an elder or the equivalent unless you have been through this process. Because as with life, we acknowledge the process of infancy through childhood into adolescence. Adolescence, that one time of life we've all been through, but we know absolutely nothing about. Would that be true? Right? Because you think you know about it, but then I can pretty much guarantee that you're going to be faced with challenges that you had no preparation for whatsoever. On your mark. And then as we get into young adulthood, and we start to take some responsibility away from the parents. We're no longer totally subordinate to the parents. We're no longer reliant on them for support. We find our own way. But in a materialist culture, that means go get a job. God, you wouldn't believe the number of times I've had "get a job" screamed at me in the last 3-4 years. Get a job. I've got one. It's saving your water. And then as we get into late 30s or whatever, maybe we have the opportunity to progress through the hierarchy in an organization and we think we're on the way to making it. And then somewhere around about the age of 40, something pulls the rug out from under you. And all the pressure around you in materialist society that we've embraced is slapping you around the face, saying, "Oh, come on, snap out of it. Get back on with what you're supposed to be doing, earning a living and providing the roof over the head for the family and everything else, and building up your personal wealth, preparing for your retirement." And half in jest, I have made the observation a number of times, if you're still doing at 55 what you were doing at 35, somewhere along the line, you have missed a major opportunity. And I completely understand the reasons why, because the pressures to still be doing at 55 what you were doing at 35 are enormous in our culture, because we have no respect for that 1,000-day process which the indigenous cultures refer to as the midlife opportunity. So, is Brian here? Brian, what was the phrase? Because I can't recall it exactly. What was the phrase used? There is a greater power within you, or when you embrace a greater power?
Well, that gives
Right. And what is the biblical quote?
Greater is he who is within you than he who is in the world.
Greater is he who is within you than he who is within the world, or something like that. Well, you know, I have a completely different interpretation of that. Completely different. And every interpretation is based on a belief system. And as Brian says, you know, if we were in a Muslim culture, then obviously our belief system, our worldview, would be based on the Muslim culture. If we were in the subcontinent of India, it might be a Buddhist or Sikh worldview. Well, my worldview is perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it's a mix of everything, because I can't really put a label on it. But consider the possibility that midlife opportunity gives you an opportunity to actually get in touch with something that's beyond this physical, empirical, material realm. So to bore the people that have seen the presentation I gave a number of years ago on the construct of the left brain and right brain. The left brain is very much a transmitter-receiver that has a very, very limited bandwidth. It is like a radio tuner, but it tunes us into this very narrow bandwidth physical reality. It doesn't actually take very much to knock us off bandwidth. And in fact, those people who experience trauma and drama almost continuously, I would suggest actually are just a little bit off kilter in terms of their bandwidth perception. But it is also a factor that the left brain needs the time construct. So we believe that there's some kind of linearity to our experience on this planet, and maybe there is. But the right brain has the capacity to operate completely outside of that. The right brain is not in any way, shape, or form constrained by the parameters of the physical realm. But funnily enough, we're not taught any of that, are we? No. But I can absolutely assure you that it is part of the initiation process just next door. Outside of this physical, empirical, material realm, there is no such thing as good and evil. It's all benign. It's up to us what we create. And it's up to us how we effectively bring about what unfolds. How many of you have had an experience where you may perceive it to be a premonition of that experience, or you visualized something that you wanted to occur, or maybe visualized a question that you wanted to have answered, and within any amount of time, not necessarily immediate, but what you visualized, or the question you asked, you got a response. How many people have had that experience? Okay. How did that happen? You can't explain it, can you? You have no way of explaining how that occurred using reductionist, Newtonian, empirical terminology. Because there's no connectivity. It's what Jung called acausal. He eventually referred to it as synchronicity. And by the way, I should acknowledge, of course, that Jung, in his later life, readily acknowledged that he got a lot of the information that he shared from a level of his consciousness that he couldn't explain. And in fact, it troubled him that he didn't actually know whether it was a deeper part of his own consciousness that he was tapping into, or it was an external consciousness that he was actually communicating with. Because in the interest of epistemological integrity, which is on the basis that if we don't actually know something, then we accept that we don't know. So on the basis that we don't know something, anything is possible. It's a hypothesis. So Jung had to come up with a construct to explain the experience of getting information from a source outside of his own waking consciousness, his left brain consciousness. And what he did eventually, he attributed it at some point to an angelic being. In fact, he drew a picture in his later life of how he visualized this contact, and he actually drew an angel. But he gave this angel a name, and that name was Philemon. So that was his construct, because he didn't have a way of explaining it in reductionist Newtonian terms. So he had to create a construct to explain how he was getting this information, which he wasn't getting from research in the physical empirical material realm. It was insight, intuition coming to him from elsewhere. Now, I know everybody in this room experiences at some point intuition or insight. It's completely normal. You know, it's completely normal to throw out a question, and then at some point you will get the response. But the establishment doesn't want you to know this. The establishment wants you to keep totally locked into this construct of this is all there is. I mean, how many people here actually believe that this is all there is, that, you know, we come into this physical arena through the birth canal, we spend 28,000 days, give or take, here. Much of that is spent acclimatizing. And at 28,000 days, that's it. We pop our clogs and that's it. It's just lost. Anybody believe that? Okay, a few? Well, if that's what you're comfortable with. I mean, it's a belief. It's not a knowledge. Epistemological integrity, I don't know. But my sense is that there's way more than this. Way, way, way more than this. We're here for 28,000 days, give or take. Some a lot less, unfortunately, for whatever reason. Others a bit more. But 28,000 days in this university. This is a university that has multiple syllabi running at any one time. Everybody's here to learn something, whatever that something may be. I mean, I do get the impression that some people actually come here for a bit of R&R. Because they seem to, you know, just be able to wallow back in absolute luxury or whatever, and provided they're not causing anybody else any harm, then so be it. So maybe they do come for R&R. Others at the other end of the spectrum do seem to come here to experience as much trauma, personal trauma and drama, as can possibly be dished out to them. Calm as a bitch. It's a hypothesis. But my sense is that most of us, if not all of us, will readily acknowledge that we actually have something within us that drives whatever it is that we're doing that we can't explain. And, you know, we can choose to ignore it completely, or we can choose to roll with it. Unfortunately, the construct of the physical realm, particularly the materialists who are trying to take total control and ownership of the physical realm, is about giving people tasks. And as we saw, I think, in one of the slides earlier, you know, the absolute epitome is the left brain. And if anybody laughs, I'm sorry, but it'll probably apply to you. If you The epitome of the left brain is the person who literally has a time manager and documents what they're going to be doing for every 15 minutes of the day. Because by keeping busy, then you cannot embrace the greater agenda. So let me just put that into perspective, because I try and work completely the opposite. I appreciate, obviously, I have that luxury right now, but the only thing, there are two things that I have on my agenda for the future. Only two. One is my daughter's wedding, which is imminent, so that one's dealt with by the end of the month. And the other one is AV8.1 even, next year. And that's it. Whatever else happens in the meantime will just unfold. And I'll just follow whatever I feel I need to be doing at that given time. Now, I appreciate it, I have that luxury to be able to do that. It didn't come overnight. And actually, some of it didn't necessarily come by choice. You know, sometimes you have to go through a bit of drama to create an opportunity. Another aspect of this, by the way, is that, some philosophers have observed that, we're only actually living when we're going through deep personal drama or personal trauma. Because that's the time at which we're actually truly living. The rest of the time, we're just existing. You're just doing whatever you do on a routine basis. That's an existence. That's not living. Living is about embracing whatever it is that this 28,000-day university has to offer. So consider that everything that's unfolding, everything that is occurring here, is actually a tremendous opportunity. I mean, a really amazing opportunity. And whilst there may be many, many other dimensions, which I certainly readily acknowledge is a hypothesis, I don't know, so it's always possible. But whatever's going on in those other dimensions doesn't really bother me right now, because this is the course that I'm studying. This is my university program right now, and I'll pursue that for whatever the duration is. I won't actually know at what point I've graduated, right? Because that will be the point at which I leave this mortal realm. Now, please don't take this the wrong way, but I am actually looking forward to the day that I leave this mortal realm, because it will mean that I have completed the contract, whatever contract it was, that I agreed to come here for this duration. And however long that duration is, that's not known to me, fortunately. So I'll keep doing whatever it is that I've got to do in the meantime. But it doesn't faze me one iota that at some point I will leave this mortal realm, because I don't believe for 1 minute that this is all there is. Because in my 60-odd years in this mortal realm, I've had far too many experiences that I can't explain to believe that this is all there is. And beyond that, I just want to take this back a pace, because, we're talking about transhumanism, but we are here as a race even for a very limited period. I mean, humanity has actually not been around, and I believe this is more than just a hypothesis. I believe the evidence is there to support it. Humanity as we know it actually hasn't been around for that long. And there have been iterations, humanoid iterations, way back. I mean, how many people are familiar with the ecostones? Anybody heard of the ecostones? 1, 2. Brilliant. Because now I can show you something you don't know. The ecostones, there's about 11,000 of these stones. And they were discovered by this gentleman. Well, they weren't discovered by him, actually. He found them being sold in his local market in the mid-1960s. And they were being sold in the mid-1960s by the indigenous population of the area, who had discovered them in a riverbed that had had the silt washed away from it in phenomenal floods. Anyway, he bought a couple of these stones and looked at them and tried to establish whether or not they were the work of the indigenous people, but he satisfied himself that they weren't, because they all told him, or the ones that were selling them told him the same story, that they found them in this riverbed where this alluvial silt had been washed away, and it was, these floods were like, not 100-year floods, 1,000-year floods. Anyway, as he started to look at these stones, he started to realize that there were scenes on these that could not be explained. And I'm only going to show you a few, because I know that you are going to go home, and one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to punch into Google ecostones, right? ICA, Ica. It's the town of Ica in Peru. And I'll just throw in an anecdote, again, something that you can't explain. I stumbled across the Ica stones around about 2003. I'd never been there, never been to Ica. But anyway, my daughter, Nicola, who many of you know from AV, she was actually doing her second world tour at the time. And she'd sent me an email to say, Dad, I'm down in Peru, going to spend a few days down in Peru, and then we're going to make our way to Chile. Anyway, I thought, okay, great, have a great time, blah, blah, blah. Are you going to go up into the Andes, Sacred Valley? And she said, no, we're just going to hang around Lima and then make our way to Chile. So anyway, that evening, I thought, my God, she's in Peru. I should get her to go to Ica. So anyway, I emailed her, and she emailed straight back, and she said, Dad, this is really weird because we're in a bus station, and we're getting a bus to Ica. And I said, okay, well, when you get to Ica, the first thing you do is you got to go to this place, it's in the Place de l'Armée, right in the heart of the Ica, which is not a massive town. And she said, why? I said, just go there, knock on the door, ask for Xavier Cabrera, and just tell him your dad told you to ask him about his stones. And she said, well, that's really weird. And I said, just do it, just do it. Anyway, they arrived in Ica at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. First thing they did was went to the Place de l'Armée, knocked on the door, and it was Xavier Cabrera's daughter who came to the door. And they said, my dad said, come and have a look at the stones. She said, well, actually, we're just closing up. Can you come back tomorrow? So Nick said, yeah, okay, we'll come back tomorrow. So first thing in the morning, they go back to this house, which has been turned into a museum, and thinking that they were going to spend about an hour just sort of looking at whatever it is that their dad had said go to take a look at. 3 days later, because what they were fascinated by, and there's 11,000 of these, and I'm going to show you about 4. What they were fascinated by was these stones, which Xavier Cabrera had amassed through letting it be known that he was in the market, and he learned to be able to differentiate between the genuine article and the ones that had clearly been forged because they thought the Indian local community thought they could make a bit of money. But what fascinated him was the scenes that depicted. And here what you see is what looks like a humanoid figure riding on the back of something that looks like a Stegosaurus. Or yeah, that one. Here we go again. Looks like riding on a pterodactyl. What we got here? Heart surgery? Or sacrifice, but heart surgery, possibly. Depictions of the dinosaurs. That's a Stegosaurus, yeah. And I don't know if I got the picture. No, I haven't got the one. But there's one of the same images that emerged in the 1940s once we had flights over the Nazca Desert, showing the Nazca lines. So how old are these things? Well, you can't carbon date rock. You can only carbon date organic material. So anyway, he worked with one of the universities, and they took a selection of the stones, and eventually they managed to track down a piece of lichen that was in one of the grooves, and it was carbon dated to 99,999 years. In other words, beyond what carbon dating can determine. On these stones, what you'll find is depictions of the continents as they were on the planet at that time, the flora and the fauna. You'll see using a telescope to look at a comet. And one of the most fascinating ones is using entheogens to contact a higher being. Entheogens, you understand the difference between entheogens and hallucinogenics. An entheogen is a natural substance that gives you the impression that you are communicating with God. Entheogen. And once again, whether you're communicating with God or whether you're tapping into, whether you're accessing that other level of consciousness like Jung, With Philemon, who knows? But you're changing the chemistry of your brain so that the right brain has the perception of making a direct contact as opposed to a generic contact. Do we know who produced these? Absolutely not. Xavier Cabrera spent his life trying to get the government of Peru and the universities to take an interest in the ecostones. And because they challenge orthodoxy, they do not want to know. Now, Cabrera wrote a single book about the stones, and he hypothesizes as to where these humanoids came from. And I think he makes the hypothetical observation, and I'm not sure on what basis, that they came from somewhere in the Sirius star system. I think it's actually related to some of the carvings on some of the rocks, but I haven't had the opportunity to take a look at all 11,000 of them. I've just looked at a few that I found online because, like I said, I haven't been there. But the ecostones, they give us an insight to a previous iteration of a humanoid life form that existed in this area 99,999 years or more ago. Let's roll the clocks forward to the 9th century. And in the 9th century, there was a civilization in Central and Northern South America that we know today, or refer to today, as the Mayans. Now, the Mayans seem to have just disappeared from the planet around about 952 AD. Now, 952 AD was just a little bit before the internet. And a little bit before any kind of mass communication. So cultures that were dotted around the world were not generally linked unless, obviously, seafarers had moved into those lands. And obviously there are suggestions like the Piri-Reis maps that suggest that actually the ancient mariners had traveled a lot further than we give them credit for. But the Mayan culture was ostensibly standalone. And we know it was about 952 because the stela, the rock stela, where had a lot of the carvings on, it was almost like they just downed tools in the year 952 in their calendar. So what happened to them? We don't know. Well, roll the clock forward to 2001, pre-9/11. I was in Belize. And actually, I'd spent a bit of time with Nick, who at the time was doing her first world tour. And while we were in Belize, I had the opportunity to go to some caves just outside a place called San Ignacio, which was part of the Tikal Mayan community. And these caves are really quite remarkable. They're wet caves. They don't flood, but there's a constant flow of water. And there are some Mayan artifacts in there. And they're open to the public. Only a limited number of people can go every day. Anyway, I took the opportunity while I was there to go 2 or 3 times, so I became sort of reasonably well known to the tour guides. Anyway, the last time that I went there were some archaeologists working on a cave that wasn't open to the public. And they invited me, I got chatting with them, and they invited me, and they said, if you've got time, why not spend a few days with us? So I spent a few days with them. And they taught me the craft of archaeology as much as you can in 3 days. And anyway, on the last day, I was in the bar with this group, and there was the professor who was about the same age as me. I was, 40-something, 44 at the time. And there was the professor, say, about the same age, a bunch of students, and then the professor's mentor, who was in his 70s. And this was like the professor's mentor's, annual trip back to Belize. And anyway, we're having a few drinks. And I said, well, guys, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you over the last few days, and thank you for sharing, your insights with me. And I said, but, none of you have addressed the $64 million question. Where did the Mayans go? 952, give or take, and just gone. So the professor says, well, that's a good question, Ian. Why don't we go around the table and see what the students have to say? So, we get the usual palliatives of drought leading to famine and migration. By the way, the Mayans had no beasts of burden. One of the amazing things about their culture, which was primarily agriculture, but there's no evidence of beasts of burden or the wheel. And by the way, there's no evidence of any mass graves or bodies or anything like that. No sign of mass death through plague or famine. There's no remains whatsoever. Anyway, so we're going around the table. And then I say to the professor, I said, so what's your thoughts, Professor? And he says, well, before I give you my thoughts, Ian, he said, maybe, I can get, this is the senior professor, maybe get him to give you his thoughts. Now, by this time, I have to say he was on about his fourth whiskey. But he took a sip of his whiskey, and he said, so, Ian, he says, your question is, where did the Mayans go? And he leaned back in his chair, and he said, what makes you think they went anywhere? And he started to articulate the hypothesis. He said, consider the possibility that this culture, from whatever its origins, because he said we don't even know its origins. He said it just seemed to manifest. But this culture reached a point of collective awareness that they simply migrated into another reality. And you could see the looks on some of the students' faces, because they obviously hadn't heard this before. And it's like, what the fuck? He's had 4 whiskeys. And the professor, the junior professor, was just smiling, going, mm-hmm. So I said, well, this is very interesting. And he articulated, he said, look, just consider the possibility that they're actually with us right now. He said, there's even the possibility that they're actually sitting around the room, just outside of our visual awareness, and actually smiling at the fact that we're even asking the question. He said, obviously, he said, it's just a hypothesis. But he said, we know this was a very, very advanced culture. And the the Aztecs who came after in that area revered their libraries because the Aztec took over their libraries. They couldn't read them. And there is actually the view that the brutality of the Aztec culture was actually due to misinterpretation of the Mayan works that they revered and maintained the libraries of. And of course, those libraries were destroyed by the Spanish. Those libraries were destroyed by Bishop Diego de Landa in the 15th century. So I said to the professor, the older professor, I said, this is really amazing. I said, how come that you've never actually written a paper about this hypothesis? And he said, well, that's real simple, Ian. He said, because I'd actually like to keep drawing my pension. And then we got into the whole other argument, of course, of how academia controls orthodoxy. Academia controls what people think. It controls people's world view. Just as the origins of humanity are controlled. Yet, if we look at the mythologies, and I use that term loosely, from all around the world, there are mythologies that talk about this current iteration of humanity being the 4th or the 5th iteration. Because, for varying reasons, other iterations didn't work out. And if we look at the myth of Noah, it actually is predated by many other mythologies before the Hebrew version. So we have to recognize that, we as a race are not infinite. We're here for a duration until such time as somebody decides to close this course down. But meanwhile, there is little doubt that what we are facing is an agenda that is seeking to literally transform humanity into a slave race. Now, this is interesting because if we look at the Sumerian mythology, this current iteration of humanity was created as a slave race. If we look at Sumerian mythology, and I don't really think the word mythology is appropriate. Mythology is a term, it's a bit like conspiracy theorist. It's used to dismiss. So let's consider that actually what we're not talking about is not mythology, it's history. It's a record of Sumerian history. Just like the Ecostones are a record of that civilization that manifested in that region of Earth a long, long, long time before our iteration appeared. Because the Sumerian mythology is that, of course, and it doesn't answer the creation myth, but the Sumerian mythology talks about a race that came from heaven to earth. The literal translation is Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. And they were here mining gold. And if ever you've done any research into Michael Tellinger, not his Ubuntu project, but the work that Michael Tellinger has done in looking at the incredible rings that have appeared in South Africa, for which there's no explanation. These cover the whole country. And again, the Sumerian history tells us that actually the Anunnaki were here for many, many thousands, if not tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years, mining gold in two centers, the Middle East, based in Iraq, and what is now Iraq, and also South Africa. And that there were two entities within the Anunnaki that were at loggerheads. They were stepbrothers, and this is Enlil and Enki. And it was, according to Sumerian history, it was Enki's partner, Ninhursag, who was the genetic engineer, who merged the DNA of the Anunnaki with the hominoids that were here on Earth at that time, which we would probably describe as Neanderthal or whatever. So as I say, this doesn't answer the creation myth, but it was the amalgamation of Anunnaki and Neanderthal man or whatever merged together to create this version of humanity as a slave race. As a slave race. And there are entities on this planet who, whether it's right or wrong doesn't matter, but they absolutely believe that they are the bloodline descendants of the Anunnaki. And therefore, they believe that they have a right to this fiefdom. And humanity are their slaves. But we're getting a little bit uppity. And so they need to get us back in check. Now, the battle gets very interesting here because there was an attempt to wipe out humanity with the flood. And the Sumerian history tells us that the council, the Anunnaki council, had all agreed that basically this iteration of humanity needed to be wiped. To serve its purpose, it needed to be wiped. But Enki, who was Ninhursag's partner, actually had second thoughts about this. And what it actually says in the tablets is that he spoke to Utnapishtim, which is the Sumerian Noah. He spoke to Utnapishtim through a veil. Now, we don't know what that veil is. It may have been psychic communication. It could have been a physical veil. But it had to be through a veil because he couldn't go against the council and talk to Utnapishtim directly. But what he did was he gave Utnapishtim the specifications to build not an ark, but effectively a submarine, covered in pitch to make it waterproof. And the animals didn't go in 2 by 2. It was the DNA, because they had the technology to use the DNA to create life. So Noah's Ark story is simply terminology that could be understood by the people of the time. This is the hermeneutics. This is the science of hermeneutics, i.e. language that can be comprehended at a particular juncture in history. So there's not a lot of point in talking about DNA pre-Crick, was there? Because DNA is a term that we have embraced post-Crick. So whatever term needed before that, that was what they used, but they took it as the animals. So what we've got here, and this is the symbolism of the post-humanist agenda. Humanity plus. Humanity plus. But what they're talking about is humanity plus in terms of the left brain construct and how their humanity plus can serve them in their agenda. And there's too many humans here right now for what they need for their agenda. So what they're doing is effectively culling. And they have many, many ways of culling. But what's also interesting is they actually get us to do it. Because in their belief system, they're actually not allowed to do it. They actually have to get us to do it to ourselves. And that's exactly what's occurring right now, in so many ways. And I'm going to just focus on this, because you will recognize every single way here that is being used to subjugate humanity, to prevent, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said just a few years ago, the biggest obstacle to establishing the new world order, the one world government, is the rapid political awakening of the masses. Then a few days later, he gave a similar presentation, but he added a very interesting rider. He said the biggest obstacle to establishing the one world government is the rapid political and spiritual awakening of the masses. Now, spiritual, the word spiritual is simply a term that we use to describe anything, any experience that we cannot explain through reductionist, empirical, Newtonian explanation. So if it hasn't got a Newtonian explanation, but it's experiential, we can't deny it, then it's labeled spiritual. In reality, those experiences are normal. They are completely normal. But society does everything it possibly can to shut it down. Anybody here seen the Russell Crowe film again? A Beautiful Mind. John Nash. John Nash was a brilliant mathematician. Brilliant. At university, at Harvard, his roommate, which he had one in this realm, absolutely understood and acknowledged that he was actually sharing a room with two people. John Nash plus his invisible friend. What an opportunity. Here was a guy, John Nash, who was literally living between the worlds, because the non-visible reality was very, very real to John Nash. And those around him who respected him acknowledged that he was able to live in this world and this world. But what did orthodoxy do? Tortured the crap out of him. Gave him electric shock treatment to try and shut this down. Because the establishment did not want anyone having any contact with anything that they couldn't control. So here was a guy who, for him, it was quite normal, because he'd experienced this all the way through his life, but the establishment shut it down through electric shock treatment. So, I mean, just look around, Melanie Shaw. What happens to anybody who challenges orthodoxy? You get labeled as a nutter. You get sectioned. I mean, the number of people who we know have tried to challenge the system, particularly raising awareness of grooming, of paedophilia. It's the fastest way to bring the full weight of the establishment down on your shoulders. How many people are familiar with the experiences of Michael Doherty? Michael Doherty, he spoke at AV8.1, I think it was. Michael Doherty discovers that somebody, he's grooming his teenage daughter, reports it to the police, and the next thing he knows, he's got the full force of the establishment literally on his shoulders. And, fortunately, I mean, the guy is a very credible individual. He's a respected aircraft engineer, I believe he is, and he resisted against the system. So what they do is just sideline him. Nothing to see here. No, you can come back. I mean, I really, really feel for these people who are challenging the system so directly that they are running the risk of being sectioned. And anyone who says that, what I do runs that risk, maybe I do. But it's less than if you challenge it direct on the paedophilia front. So what we're doing here, obviously, we're starting very young with the vaccine program. As Graham has alluded to, 24 preschool vaccines in this country, 36 in the States. In Australia now, if you are on social benefits and you don't vaccinate your children, social benefits are withheld. And I absolutely concur with Graham and his observations of universal income. It's being surreptitiously introduced in this country as universal credit. Yeah. And you're seeing the articles about people who are becoming homeless when they move on to universal credit because of the delays in payments being made out. Universal credit is part of creating the slave. Because you have a lot of companies, Amazon's one, a lot of these warehousing companies, who, if you are on universal credit, then basically you have to be available for work. And if you want to keep receiving your universal credit, then you will go work for these companies for 12 weeks on the basis that there's the possibility of a job on offer afterwards. So what they're doing is they're working these people on universal credit, they're working them on night shifts, 12-hour night shifts sometimes, and of course at the end of 12 weeks there's no job. And why would there be? Because for the corporation they've got a ready flow of people on universal credit. Universal credit is about creating the slave. Where the culling comes is basically people who don't want to take universal credit and are not making a direct contribution to the corporatocracy. Because you're either on universal credit and you're a slave, or you're making a direct contribution to the corporatocracy, or you're a useless eater. And you're a waste of resources. So, we've got the vaccines, we've got the GM foods, there's more nutrition in some of the packaging that some of these foods come in. We've got the fluoride in the water, which fortunately, more and more communities are beginning to rise up against. I mean, what do we need to say about the programs? It's not called they're not called TV programs for no reason. Obviously, the alcohol and the increasing strength of alcohol. And I think Graham made the observation, I think was that AV8 or AV7, I can't remember now. Our greatest value in many respects, if you're a useless eater, is for your organs. Particularly for the likes of Rockefeller. What did he have? Oh no, it's Dick Cheney who had, I think it was 9 heart transplants. Rockefeller had a whole bunch too. They just keep rejuvenating. And obviously in the developing nations, with the child trafficking, the biggest value of these children is sadly in their organs. So we are dealing with something that is what we consider in this realm to be absolutely evil, because it is not looking after humanity's best interests. And from the Sumerian history that I've read, I actually believe that the inference in that history is that Enki, when he passed on the information to Utnapishtim through the veil, the reason he did it was because he actually believed that this iteration of humanity actually had an opportunity. It was a pretty good iteration. I mean, he had no skin in the game other than it was his partner, Ninhursag, that was the genetic engineer that had produced this iteration. But Enki believed that this iteration of humanity deserved a chance. And then at some point, probably around about 9,500 years BC, who knows, give or take, the Anunnaki left this planet. We assume. We don't know. I mean, if we look at even the Bible tells us that the relationship between man and the gods, small g, was one that was actually quite casual. First of all, we know from Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, that the Elohim were the gods, small g, plural, were having sex with humans. We know that when the gods, Yahweh according to the biblical text, but other names elsewhere, when Yahweh told Sarah, who was in her 90s, Abraham's wife, that she would have children, she basically went, yeah, right. And she was berated for doubting her God, her better. So we know that, we can assume that the relationship was fairly casual, so that, there was probably some kind of coexistence. But all of that has been pushed aside unless you go next door. Because next door, and I've never been next door, but I have been in the largest Masonic lodge in the US, which is in Guthrie, Oklahoma. And I can tell you that this knowledge is shared with them. That's part of their system. The first 3 degrees, the blue degrees, are benign. The real learning comes, from the 4th degree up to the 33rd degree. So the reality is that these guys learn through initiation. We learn through experience. So they're told what's possible. We only know what's possible through experience. And what they're really concerned about is humanity actually tapping into that power within. Now, if you wish to call it God or put a name on it, like Jung did with Philemon, whatever, that's, whatever the prerogative. I'm not trying to suggest for one moment that I have the definitive view of anything. But what I do know is that every one of you knows that you have power that you're not using. And much of this comes from using your right brain to actually visualize the type of future you would like to see. Now, you can do it selfishly and focus on the future for you, or you can be a bit more generic. And this was something that was brought home to me when I went to Peru in 2010 to meet with the Cuero. And those of you who know the story know that I broke my ankle on my first day there, which was like, great, I've paid all this money to come all this way. Now I can't sort of participate in any of the ceremony or whatever was going on. I went out of pure curiosity, because the Cuero disappeared from the face of the earth for 400 years because they were chased into the high Andes by the conquistadors. And the conquistadors, of course, said, yeah, we nailed them. You won't be seeing them in a hurry. But they didn't. They chased them into the high Andes. And they came out in the mid-1960s. And the reason they came down from the high Andes was because in their folklore, they always knew that they were going to be chased into the mountains. And they were going to be there for 25 generations. And what they did was they ticked off the generations as they came down. So 400 years later, in the mid-60s, they came down. And it just so happens that there was a young anthropologist there by the name of Alberto Villoldo, who was so fascinated by what they had to say that he spent his career effectively devoted to learning what they had to offer and then trying to share it. And then sadly in later days making money from it, big money from it. But anyway, that's another side. Without him, the knowledge would not have got out into the wider arena. Anyway, there was the opportunity to go visit with him. And even the way that happened was something quite remarkable, because I'd had in my head that I wanted to go visit with the Cuero, but everything on the Alberto Villoldo's website said that you had to be following one of his Four Winds programs. Well, I wasn't. So, but anyway, I thought I'll give them a call and just see whether it's possible. So I called the office, and this guy answered the phone. And I said, look, I'm just calling on the off chance that I might be able to join the trip that Alberto's got organized to go to the Sacred Valley in May, I think it was, 2010. And this guy said, yeah, okay, well, we can talk about that. He said, I assume you're following the Four Winds program. And I said, well, actually, I'm not. I'm just really inquiring as to whether I can, sort of tag along. And he said, well, that's not normally what happens. But he said, I'll take your details. And so I said, well, my name's Ian Crane. And there was a silence at the other end. And he said, well, is that Ian R. Crane? I went, yeah. And this guy said, well, 3 days ago, he said, I'd never heard of you. But somebody sent me a DVD of a presentation that you did on Codex Alimentarius. And he said, and that's how I know you. He said, by the way, you're talking to Alberto Villoldo. So anyway, I got onto the trip. Broke my ankle on the first night there. And I had two choices. I could either fly home or say, well, I just see what happens. So I thought, I'll see what happens. So the rest of the groups are going up into the mountains to sort of participate in these Cuero ceremonies, and I'm sort of stuck about 100 meters from wherever the coach drops us off, because I can't really go very far. And on the first day, I'm sitting there for a couple of hours thinking, this is great, isn't it? Spent all this money, come all this way, and I'm sitting on a rock. Okay, nice view, nice weather, Anyway, after a couple of hours, one of the Cuero I saw walking down the hill, and he came and sat right alongside me. But we couldn't communicate. He didn't speak any English. I didn't really speak Spanish, and certainly not Quero. Anyway, a little while later, a second guy came along, and they were chatting away, laughing at each other, kept pointing to the plaster cast on my... And then I discovered that they knew one English word, idiot. Oh, idiot. Oh. Anyway, then a little while later, this girl came along, whose name was Velma. Well, that was how I pronounced it. Velma. And she spoke good English. And she was the youngest member of the Quero that was working with Alberto. Anyway, the three of them sat there, and as we now got into some discussion, I mean, it was very, very interesting. And I'm not going to bore you with all the stuff that they shared over 3 days. But one of the things that they absolutely made the observation of is that they'd come out of the mountains because they wanted to try and influence. They wanted to try and help humanity resist what they perceived was coming. And they said, but there are two things. There are two things that you absolutely must do if you want to participate in bringing about the change. The first thing is, obviously, you must get involved. You've got to find a way to get involved. And obviously, there's many, many ways in which we can get involved, but you must find a way to get involved. But they said, in of itself, just getting involved isn't enough. You've actually got to find the time to visualize your desired outcome for whatever it is that you're trying to bring about for change. But you must not have any attachment to your visualization. So you give it your best shot, but whilst at the same time acknowledging that what is possible may be beyond your wildest imagination. So you put out the visualization, that's your best shot, and obviously part of that visualization is, show me how I need to participate in this. What you're doing is you're asking your left brain to get out the way, to allow the right brain to access whatever is out there to show you the path that you need to take. And they said, if you just visualize, it's extremely limited. If you just take the action, it's extremely limited. But you combine both, and you will be amazed at what occurs. And I mean, all I can tell you is that it's 7 years since they shared that insight with me, and it's not possible for me to go back to any other way of life. Because this is just it's just too amazing. It's really amazing. And the experience that I'm able to embrace by not having an agenda. I mean, obviously, I visualize that I want to see these motherfrackers disappear and ride off into the sunset. And you know what? It really frustrates me that Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland have all got bans on fracking. So where am I going wrong? Now, that's an amazing result for the communities in those countries. An absolutely incredible result. But obviously, there's still more learning to do here. And, it is tougher in England because in England, people have fallen for the construct. I mean, Brian, in one of his last slides, showed the construct that people believe to still exist of democracy. And in North Yorkshire, at Kirby Misperton right now, and I got to be careful what I say because of the camera here, but great action last Monday, guys. Still got scars. Anyway, and Kirby Misperton is in the heart of North Yorkshire. Now, North Yorkshire is more conservative with a small c and a capital C than the south of England. It's old money. People have been there for generations. The joke up there is that you could put a stuffed monkey up for election with a blue rosette and it would still get elected. But what's happening there is people are starting to see that this perception they had of democracy doesn't exist. It's falling away. And there's a lovely, lovely gentleman there who's a former classics teacher from a public school. And you couldn't make this up. His name is Mr. Pickles. Anyway, he's 80, And he's a lovely guy. And a few years ago, after we'd finished the Crawberry Hill campaign, he gave me permission to put my caravan into a copse adjoining his house. And of course, over the years, you know, I've shared a meal with him, or sit down and had coffee. Anyway, some weeks ago, he came up to me, he said, Ian, he said, I have to say, he said that some of the subjects that you've addressed in the last 3 years, while we've been having dinner together, he said, I must confess that I always thought they were a bit of a stretch. But he said, I'm actually beginning to realize that you're absolutely spot on. So this is a guy of 80, public school teacher, never, ever had cause in his life to question orthodoxy. And now the scales are falling away from his eyes. And that is the case with so many other people in that community. So in many ways, actually, this whole fracking thing is a gift. It's a gift, provided we don't let it happen. Because what it's doing is it's actually giving us an opportunity to reunite these communities and actually show the community what collective capabilities they have when they really get their act together. And if we can get them to do a bit of visualization as well, who knows what will happen. And it's the same with this transhumanist agenda. I'm unfortunately going to acknowledge that it's not going to be pretty in the next few years. And as is always the case, it has to get worse before we really have an opportunity. This is the alchemical process of solvere coagula. You have to destroy to be able to rebuild. Well, that's what they're doing. They're looking to destroy humanity to rebuild the post-humanist, i.e. the people who will simply subjugate themselves to their agenda. But what we have to do, we have to raise awareness as much as we possibly can, and as you've seen today, the evidence is clearly there. The evidence is undeniable. But like all these things, it doesn't really hit home, does it, until it gets right up close and personal. It's like the NHS. You know, the politicians like Hammond keep telling us, no, it's just a conspiracy theory that the NHS is being destroyed. And then you have personal experience of it, and it's obvious. It's completely obvious. And you think, how can those people believe that it's not being destroyed? And it's the same with transhumanism. It's with this agenda. We've seen it. The microchipping. The company in Wisconsin that's now microchipping its employees because they wanted to be the first. Everybody's going to do it. We might as well be the first. I have no idea how this is going to pan out. But what I do know is that collectively, if we focus and visualize and participate, then what these guys are trying to do in terms of their subjugation of humanity isn't going to work out the way they want. Who knows? It may be that we end up being like the Mayans, you know, and that we simply move into a different reality. I think in Christian terms that might be called the rapture. I'm not suggesting that for a moment, but who knows? But it's just simply, you know, merging into different realities. You know, one of the hypotheses of the dimensional multiverse is that every single decision that we take, in some reality, we take every one of those decisions. That it all branches off into another realm. So, you know, what's going on right now in other multiverses may be based on every decision that I've ever taken being completely the opposite of the one I've taken in this realm. Who knows? I mean, it sounds pretty fucked up, but who knows? Epistemological integrity, we have to keep an open mind. So I don't believe for 1 minute that what's occurring here is a disaster. It's an opportunity for learning. And everything that is occurring, we have to embrace as an opportunity for learning. And that means actually finding the time, quiet time, to sit back and reflect. And I'm not suggesting, you know, meditation. I'm not a natural meditator. I mean, don't tell DVLA this, but I spend a lot of my quiet time is going up and down the motorways in the dead of night when the roads are empty. And sometimes I think, oh my God, how did I cover the last 30 miles? Yeah. And somehow we do, don't we? Because somehow the left brain knows what it's supposed to do, And the right brain, we've managed to get our waking consciousness into the right brain. So the left brain just carries on doing what it's been trained to do. And the right brain is out there accessing whatever it can access. Why do we say sometimes if we've got a major decision to make, we'll sleep on it? Because the left brain needs sleep, the right brain doesn't. You know, if you ever have a major decision to make, never, ever make it with the left brain. The left brain is really messed up. It's been so conditioned, it's been so programmed, you've got to get it out of the way. So if ever there's anything that you need to address from a personal basis, you have to sleep on it. And you have to allow the right brain then to access whatever other things it can access to allow whatever changes need to be made within this space-time continuum that we perceive as reality, which is little more than 28,000 days, which in the wider scheme of things is about that. So how many times have we done this before? I have no clue. How many times are we going to do it again? I have no clue. It might be Groundhog Day. You know, we might go back and when we're reflecting, which of course in Egyptian mythology is sitting before Thoth and having our heart weighed against the feather. But it may be that we're reflecting, because the only person that reflects on our lives is us, not the ego self, not the left brain, but the... So we reflect and, you know, consider the possibility. We go, damn, I just wish I'd done that one thing differently. Okay, off you go. And you've got to go through the whole process again. Who knows? We don't know. We can't know whilst we're in this physical realm. And anybody tells you they do know, it's probably time to go and sort of walk in the other direction. But what is important is that we keep an open mind and that we don't allow ourselves to buy in to the construct, which is what the establishment wants. The establishment wants to structure your worldview. And right now they're trying to structure your worldview, but the smartest thing you can do is subject yourself to their trans-humanist agenda. Reflect on it, sleep on it. Visualize your preferred outcome. Because I think that we are on the cusp of something pretty awesome. I have no idea what it is, but just call it a hunch. That I think there's so many things that are coming together right now, or falling apart, whichever way you look at it. You know, and they're trying to destroy it through the likes of Common Purpose by putting in their agents of change. What they haven't banked on is there's a damn sight more of us than there is of them. And you know what? The more people have to experience drama and trauma, then I think the more they open up to what I'm suggesting. And for those of you who are under 40, sitting there thinking, what a load of bollocks. And I completely understand that. I totally understand. For those of you who are over 40 and think it's a load of bollocks, I would encourage you to find some time to reflect and then just see what happens, because you have to at least open the possibility to this. And it's only when you open yourself to the possibility that there may be more to our 28,000 days here than we give credit for. And then when the stuff starts to happen, my God, it's amazing. It's tough sometimes, but that's a reminder. That's a reminder. You know, 25 years ago, I had no concept of life without a salary. Now I have no concept of life with a salary. That said, I mean, I readily acknowledge that, you know, I am dependent on benefactors, etc. But what's incredible is, you know, the number of times where I've been in a situation where I don't even have the money to be able to put fuel in the car to get where I need to get to next. And then just before I'm about to leave, you know, it appears somewhere, somehow. You know, it's having that. And it's not confidence, because I don't take it for granted, because I am a lazy son of a gun. I am really naturally lazy. And so actually being forced to make a contribution to do something is part of, you know, the motivation. I don't take anything for granted. I know how I have to put in my effort for the universe to give me the return to be able to do whatever it is that, you know, I'm doing at that particular juncture. Does that resonate with anybody in the room? Good. Because if it doesn't, we got a real problem. Because this is what Zbigniew Brzezinski has acknowledged that the establishment are really scared of. They are scared of the rapid political and spiritual awakening of the masses. And let's not get bogged down in the definition of spiritual. I'm defining spiritual simply as anything that we can't explain by reductionist Newtonian empirical experience. So I hope that we've been through the depths of the darkness of this agenda, and it's really, really important that you know, because if you don't know, you have no idea what you're dealing with. It's like any game. If you don't know the rules of the game, you've got no chance. So you have to know what you're dealing with, and I think Graham, Patrick, and Brian have given us a real insight into what is unfolding here. Now it's up to us to find an individual and a collective way to respond and make sure that whatever the outcome is, that it's beneficial to humanity and that we're not condemning future generations to lives of effective abject slavery. So thanks very much.